Well, hello, dolls. For this project, I decided to go back to my customizing roots and chose this Disco Boogie Blythe doll as the base. She was released in April 2003 and has been sitting in my collection for about a year or two. The first step in disassembling a Blythe is to remove the screws in her backplate and pressing on the sides of the head until her body lifelessly plops out of her neck. Then you snip the pull string. Because this mold is an EBL, it comes apart a little differently than some of the Blythes I've worked on in the past. You see, the dome is attached and the scalp is glued onto the dome, so I'm letting the head sit in boiling water with a little bit of dish soap to break the glue bond. Then I gently pull the scalp from the dome and faceplates. Here you can see that the dome is attached and is covered in this gross 20-year-old glue. Blah. Then I pull the two plates apart and marvel at how rusty the spring is. I mean, I suppose 20 years of humidity will do that, but yuck, right? Blythes have 4 sets of eyes that work with a mechanism to change when activated. To remove the mechanism, I first unscrew the T-bar. This bar determines where the doll's gaze will sit after rotating. We'll worry about that later. Next, I have my wife gently pry the entire mechanism out of the pegs on the sides of the faceplate. To remove the eyes from the lids, you need to pop this plastic spring from the eyelid plastic, but be careful not to damage either piece. Then, gently pry the eye pegs from the lids, and we're finally ready to start customizing. Look, I'm about to tell you my unpopular opinion. Stock Blythe dolls are kinda ugly. I'm not a fan. But I love the way they look when they're customized. So, acetone melts this type of plastic, so the only way to remove the gloss coating and makeup is by sanding it off. Once it's sanded, I can easily draw in her new features. Then, with some scalpels, wood carving tools, and some diamond Dremel bits, I'm able to start shaping. However, midway through this procedure, I decided I wanted her mouth to be slightly open. So I began to drill and carve the opening. Then, in order to fit the things that are inside her mouth, I needed to remove this interior piece of her faceplate. Once I was happy with the shape of her mouth, I moved on to her nose. When I believe I'm finished carving, I begin to smooth out the entire face with finer and finer grits of sandpaper. By the end, I should have a very smooth faceplate with little to no imperfections. Next is the holy Mr. Super Clear Matte. As usual, I begin by adding my subdermal color zone layers. Recently, I've been using a combination of Sennelier and Pan Pastel chalk pastels. Then, once I'm happy with the base colors, I begin to add shadows using browns, blues, and purples. And then a little pink pigment for the lips. Then I spray another layer of Mr. Super Clear Matte. On this layer, I begin by adding white to the waterline and drawing in the lacrimal caruncle. I decided to try something new with this doll by drawing a lid line and shading it. Then I added more dimension to the lips and used pastels to draw a basic eyebrow shape. Then I saved my progress with another coat of Mr. Super Clear Matte. Oh boy, okay, this was my first time using gouache to paint the eyebrows. I've never used gouache, so is the Arteza gouache even any good? Let me know in the comments. I didn't feel like it was as smooth as some customizers say, even though I watered it down quite a bit. It did make for some beautiful eyebrows, though. I also used gouache for the lined upper lid and the lashes. Then I protected my work again with another spray of Mr. Super Clear Matte. On this layer, I used gouache to highlight the waterline and used watercolor pencil to add lines to the lips. Then I gave the faceplate a final spray, but this time with Mr. Super Clear Semi-Gloss. Finally, I added gloss varnish to her lips, the corners of her eyes, and her waterline. Blythes come with these eyes, but this set had a seam running through them. So, of course, the only reasonable thing to do was print our own. I started by sanding the outside to remove layer lines and then painted the iris. Unfortunately, when we began to add the resin to the pupils, some odd bubbling began to happen over and over again, so we had to pivot. I moved on to making glass eye chips with my handy-dandy pupil painter. You place the eye chip inside, place the cover on top, dip the pupil stamp into your paint, and then push it through the hole. Now you have a painted pupil. Then I painted on my iris colors. I also glossed the eyes so they would look wet. Then, using tacky glue, I attached the eye chips. But this also made strange bubbles, so I had to pivot again. You guessed it, I ended up going with her original eyes. But we'll replace the chips, of course. To remove the old chips, I heated the end of a hot glue stick with a lighter, then placed it on the chip. Once that cooled, I was able to easily pop the chips out. Then I glued in some new chips. To remove the eyelashes from the eyelids, I let them soak in the same mixture I used to remove her scalp. This breaks down the glue enough so they come right out. Then I remove the gloss with sandpaper sponges. Next, I boggle the eyes, which means I'm cutting a notch in the back of the eyelids so the whole mechanism can open a little more. If you've watched my previous Blythe videos, you might know that I usually add masking tape to nearly every surface of the lids so that I can airbrush them. Well, now I found this stuff and I'm absolutely in love. Next, I spray black primer. For the color, I'm going to use my favorite prismatic paints, but I'm going to use 2 colors to make a 4-color gradient. Then seal it with Mr. Super Clear Gloss. Next, I remove the masking and then mask the painted area. Then spray it with Mr. Super Clear Matte. Here, I'm adding some chalk pastels to make these parts look like the inner eye. Then I seal it with Mr. Super Clear Gloss. I just adore all of the color shifting that's going on here. Next, I trim some human fake lashes to size and then glue them into the eyelash notches using tacky glue. Finally, my wife put the eyes back together for me. As attractive as a huge gaping mouth is, let's fill that hole in her face. First, my wife designed and 3D printed a top row of teeth, tongue, and inner mouth for her. Then I mixed up some gouache paint and colored the gums and soft palette. I gave the tongue a more pink tone and stippled some light pink on top to give it some texture. Then I added some watered down baby green to the teeth, and then quickly wiped it away so it was only left in the crevices. Then I added color to the gums. Next, we added resin to all of the pieces to make them look moist. Then we set the entire piece in place with UV resin. I knew I wanted this character to have like an elf-like appearance, so I stole these ears from a doll I made my wife several years ago. I prepped the resin just like I did with her face by sanding off the gloss and spraying it with several layers of MSC. Then I followed the same subdermal color zone rules with chalk pastels and added shading with a little bit of purple. Then set it in place with MSC. In my mind, this little witch spends a lot of time with her nose in books, so we designed and printed some oversized glasses for her. Then I sprayed Mr. Surfacer 500, 1000, and 1200, combined with sanding between each spray until I had a smooth finish. Next, I used my airbrush to coat them in 3 coats of copper conductive paint. Then we electroplated them with first copper and then nickel. Next, we used an electroplating pen to coat them in 18-karat gold. Using the same plastic we used to make Grogu's submarine, we cut lenses with our X-Tool machine. Then we popped them in, and her glasses were finished. Do you remember the scalp? Yeah, that thing. Well, I'm gonna chop off all of that beautiful hair. And let me tell you, there was a lot of it. Then, with a pair of forceps, I pulled the plugs from the inside. And surprisingly, there was a lot of hair in there too. Finally, I was left with a clean scalp. Well, let's make it a little more clean. Off camera, I masked the edges and painted the scalp a pretty lavender. Then I drew where I felt the bangs were going to start, so I could put some extra plugs in that space. Finally, the gorgeous hair. I purchased this super soft dyed alpaca hair from Etsy. I'll link the store if you'd like more information. So I started by brushing through the locks with a dog slicker brush. Then, using an awl, I pulled out a small plug from the hank. Then I wet the root end with my fingertips and wrap it around my finger. Next, I scoop up the plug with my rooting tool and then plunge it into the scalp. When I finished the entire scalp, I trimmed the hairs inside and set them in place with Fabri-Tac glue. Then I brushed through the hair again with a slicker brush to remove the tangles. I'll do more with this later, but I'm just so jazzed at how pretty these waves look. My fashion inspiration for this doll is something similar to dark academia. So I designed a blouse that had poofy sleeves, a button-up front, and a ruffled collar. First, I made my bodice pieces, then moved on to the sleeves. This part was a little tricky. I started by creating a sleeve block, then widened the pattern so the pieces could be gathered. Then separated my pattern into 3 pieces. I was originally designing the pattern with some interfacing and a standing collar, but it simply didn't work with my fabric. So that's why you see a few pieces that I didn't use. Then I cut the pieces out of the same fabric I used for the inner lining of Lily's bonnet. You see, I used this project as a bit of a stash buster, meaning I didn't purchase any new fabrics. For example, this lace was used as the gathered underside of the brim of her bonnet. Okay, now for the sewing. For the placket, I folded the side edges back and pressed. Then I lined it up with the center of my front and top stitched down both sides lengthwise. Next, I attached the back pieces to the front by stitching them along the shoulder seam. Using the lace fabric, I folded it over and sewed 2 rows of gathering stitches. Then gently pulled the back threads to gather the fabric. Next, I pinned the lace around the neck seam and hand-stitched it in place with a back stitch. On the lower arm piece, I also did 2 lines of gathered stitching to create ruffles on both ends. Then I made bias tape out of the lower cuff fabric and machine stitched the bottom of the sleeve along the inner fold of the cuff. Then folded the tape over the raw edge of the sleeve and secured it on the inside with a felling stitch. I wanted to bring in more of that lace detail, so I laid it over the bicep cuff piece. Then laid both pieces over the top of the lower arm piece, right sides together, and sewed it in place. Next, I ruffled the top sleeve, again using 2 rows of gathering stitch. Then sewed it to the upper arm cuff, right sides facing together. Next, I pinned the sleeve into the bodice arm side and hand stitched it in place with a back stitch. Then I have this fun piece of origami. I fold the right sides together and sew the sleeve and the side seam closed. Then I fold over and hem the bottom of the blouse. Next, I fold over the raw edge of the back and attach some Velcro, with one side of the Velcro extending past the edge of the garment. This makes the back pieces line up perfectly with little bulk. Finally, I hand sewed some tiny buttons to the placket on the front to finish the illusion. Now that I have her blouse made, I take new measurements so it can fit on top of her shirt. I've decided to make this a circle skirt so it'll be nice and full, but not bulky around her waist. I'm only going to draft 1/4 of the pattern so I can fold the fabric to get a full circle. I begin by drafting 1/4 of her waist circumference, then use a compass to draw the length of the skirt. Then I cut my pattern piece out. I chose to make her skirt out of this purple taffeta that I used for Charité's robe à la Française gown. Since her hair has a violet hue, I figured that a purple skirt would work well on her. Before cutting, I folded and pressed the fabric once in half and then in half again lengthwise. Then placed the pattern so the edges lined up with both edges of the fabric. Then marked and cut along the pattern lines. And voila! I've made a taffeta donut. Then I cut the back of the donut to make a skirt opening. Next, I cut some strips of fabric perpendicular to the fabric grain to make the waistband. I then cut some of the pink taffeta from Lily's dress into long strips to make ruffles. And prepped it by folding it in half lengthwise and pressing. I also pressed the waistband fabric into double fold bias tape. Next, I pinned the waist of the skirt to the first fold of the bias tape and hand sewed them together using a backstitch. Then I snipped the raw edge to help the fabric curve and encased it all with the rest of the bias tape, like I did with the blouse cuff. Next, I ran 2 rows of gathering stitch down the long side of the ruffle fabric and pulled the strings to make ruffles. Then pinned and sewed the ruffle to the hem of the skirt. Off camera, I added Velcro the same way I did with the blouse, then closed the remaining back of the skirt. With a fork and some thin gold ribbon, I apparently struggled to make several tiny bows. Then I added fray check to the ends. And hand sewed them to the skirt. I even added a few to the upper cuffs of the blouse. And with that, she has a poofy skirt. To start the petticoat, I cut what seemed like 2 miles of netting material. You see, I purchased this stuff to use on Emily, but never ended up using it. Next, I sewed some lace to the hem of the petticoat. Then on the waist end, I folded over the edge and sewed about an inch away from the fold. Next, I cut some elastic to her waist measurement and fed it through the opening at the waist I just created with a safety pin. Next, I sewed the elastic to close the loop and sewed the back seam. But I quickly realized that this fabric was far too white to work with my dark academia aesthetic. So I added 2 rows of brown lace to make it feel more vintagey. For her knee-high socks, I made a pattern by wrapping her leg in scrap fabric and then sewing as closely to her body as I could. Then I pulled it off her leg and poked a pin through the fabric in order to transfer the design to my graph paper. Next, I drew a line where the pinholes were. Then cut it out so I could trace it onto a folded piece of paper to make a mirrored pattern piece. I really love this rib knit fabric that I used for Nicholas's shirt last Christmas. So I traced and cut my pieces, including a small piece to act as a cuff. I folded that piece in half lengthwise and pinned it to the top of my sock. Then, using a zigzag stitch, I sewed the 2 pieces together while pulling gently on the cuff piece. The zigzag allows the fabric to still stretch, while the gentle pulling makes the top pull in a bit to look like a real sock cuff. Then I fold the entire piece in half and sew down the back. To me, a waistcoat feels like a necessity in order to achieve that dark academia look. So I used my bodice pieces as a block pattern and traced them onto graph paper. Then I found the doll's measurements with clothing on and adjusted the pattern for those new parameters. Next, I widened the pattern so the pieces could overlap and brought the neckline down to look more like a vest. I also adjusted the back piece to fit the new armhole and side seam. For my outer fabric, or fashion fabric, I'm using the same houndstooth that I used for Elias's waistcoat. For the lining fabric, I'm using the pretty pink taffeta again. While I only drafted half of the back pieces, I cut them as one piece by flipping the pattern. At my sewing machine, I sewed the back pieces together at the arm, hem, and neck, then flipped it all right side out. For my front pieces, I sewed the outer and inner pieces together from the shoulder down the front and along the bottom, and the arm side, then flipped those pieces right side out. Then sewed my front pieces to the back at the shoulder and side seams. I closed the waistcoat at the front with snaps and adorned it with more of those tiny gold buttons. Of course, every proper waistcoat needs a cinch in the back. So, I found an adorable gold buckle and used some of the gold ribbon from the bows. On one end of the ribbon, I fed it through the buckle and glued it to itself so that the buckle can still pivot. Then I cut the ribbon to size and folded over and glued the opposite end. Then sewed that end to the back of the waistcoat. I did the same thing on the other side and then fed it through the buckle. Now, this little witch needs a form of transportation. My wife designed and printed a broom handle for me. Then I sanded it with finer and finer grits of sandpaper to remove the layer lines. Next, I painted the handle dark brown and the saddle a medium brown as a base layer. Then I dry brushed on some lighter shades of brown to both of them to give them texture. For the bracket that holds the seat to the handle, I applied brass gilding paint. Then coated the sandal and handle with matte varnish. Now to make this puppy fly. My wife designed a mechanism that works with a stepper motor to make the broom move up and down.
Wow.
Now that the handle is dry, my wife thatched the head of the broom. We found this floral filler pieces on Etsy and figured they might work for bristles. They were a little fluffier than we were expecting, but I think with enough layers and trimming it into submission, that it turned out rather nice. What do you think?
Ready for takeoff.
Then we built a box to house the mechanism and fed wires through the handle to attach it. Next, May rewired a small string of purple twinkle lights and fed them through the housing. Then we fed one tiny LED bulb to the tip of the broom and placed it in a jar with a tiny pair of wings to simulate a fairy. Finally, we covered the lights with pillow stuffing to make clouds. You all know by now that I prefer jointed bodies, but the Obitsu bodies come a little loose for these giant head dolls, so I needed to make some adjustments. Hey, do you remember that T-bar from the beginning of the video? Well, if you sand off a little bit of the tip of the T-bar, you can make the doll's eyes look up even more so she doesn't look like she's so dead inside. Next, I tried to attach her ears, but they didn't fit quite right. So I did the only rational thing and sanded off her original ones. Then I had my wife attach them with super glue. Then I fed her neck through a new neck joint that we made and secured it with a screw. Next were her pull strings. With the brown cord, I fed it through the hole at the bottom of the eye mechanism. Then I secured it with a knot and melted the end so it wouldn't unravel. I fed the pink through the top hole where the spring was attached and secured it the same way. Then I fed the other ends of the cording through the hole in the backplate where the spring was attached. Then I popped on the faceplate and replaced the screws in the back. Next, I squeezed some E6000 onto the dome of the head and then carefully fit her scalp back on. Then secured it in place with rubber bands for 24 hours until the adhesive was cured. Finally, it was time to cut her hair. I started by sectioning out the hair I wanted to use for her bangs, then smoothed it with a flat iron. Next, I pulled a little from the middle section and began trimming. On the outer sections, I tapered the hair down so it would blend in. Then I added some layers to the bangs and thinned them out a bit too. I trimmed the rest of her hair a bit so it looked even. Then I wet her hair and applied some curling gel while scrunching the hair in my fingers. Then I plopped her hair into a t-shirt to let dry. Now for her pull charms. I started by figuring out how low I wanted the pull strings to go down her back and tied a knot. Then I picked out my beads and charms. Then fed the beads onto my cording. Tied a knot at the bottom to help prevent the beads from moving too much. Then I tied on my charms and melted the knot again to prevent it from unraveling. Finally, this little witch needs a hat. I started by measuring her head circumference with all of this fluffy hair. Then I figured out how wide I wanted the brim to be and drew out the head circumference in the center of that. Then I went back to high school geometry to figure out these measurements. In order to figure out the slant height of my hat, I need to use the Pythagorean theorem. And let me tell you, my geometry is a bit rusty. With a string the length of my slant height and a pen and pencil, I was able to draw my pattern. For the brim, I decided to line it with the same cream-colored fabric I used from her shirt, with the lace overlay. I also decided that it needed some stability, so I included a layer of embroidery stabilizer. And the outer layer was to be pink. For the point, I only cut a lining and outer layer. At my sewing machine, I pinned my brim pieces and sewed around the outside. Then notched around the entire perimeter and turned it right side out. With some gold wire, I made a hoop the size of my brim circumference and stuffed it into the brim. Then pinned it in place and top stitched just inside the wire to help keep it in place. For the point, I folded my fabric in half and sewed along the slant height. I did the same for my lining, except I also hand sewed some wire to the seam allowance. Then I folded over and pinned my seam allowance for my outer fabric and sewed them with an invisible stitch. Next, I sewed some ribbon to some lace and stitched it on to cover the seam. With a scrap of purple fabric, I folded it in half and sewed around the perimeter, and did the same with a narrow piece too. Then with both pieces turned right side out, I was able to wrap the narrow piece around to make a bow. Finally, I was able to insert the lining point right side in and again stitched it with an invisible stitch. Off camera, I decorated the hat with a few plastic flowers. And with that, she's done.
Okay, I don't want to take up too much time from this already very long video, but I want to share with you, my favorite dolls, some exciting news. Drum roll, please. I've started a Patreon. Why? Well, because this costs money, and, well, this costs money, and, this costs money too. I think you're starting to get the idea. Now, I never thought I'd create a Patreon, but making dolls, especially my complicated ones, and producing YouTube videos costs money. And, well, my family has been struggling over the past year, so it's time to ask for some support. What do you get with your membership? Well, I currently have plans for a monthly one-day build where I choose a project and live stream the entire process from start to finish. That might mean watching me draft a pattern and sew it, or create some sort of prop, or whatever my mind can come up with, and you can be involved in the process. Plus, there's all sorts of extras like access to a special Discord, sneak peeks at current doll projects, discounts on patterns and products from my shop, and much, much more. If you're interested, check out the link in the description. Okay, let's reveal this doll already.
Now I'm very proud to introduce you to Willow, the Autumnal Witch. For my longtime viewers, thank you for sticking by me this past year. I hope to make next year even more interesting as I learn and grow as a video maker. Thank you so much for your kindness and support. For new viewers, welcome! If you enjoyed watching this, please subscribe and turn on notifications. Every sub, bell ringing, like, and share makes me do a little happy dance. Also, don't forget to leave a comment. I love chatting with you all afterwards. And if you have the means, I would really love to see you over at my new Patreon. I cannot wait to get to know you better. Also, the patterns in this video will be available in my shop, so go check them out. Well, that's it for 2023. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you had a sweet time.